Hi, I'm Chris Hughes. Thank you for joining another Aquia webinar. Today we'll be discussing detection engineering, the intersection of security operations and software engineering. And today I'm joined by two folks. We have Dakota Riley from the Aquia team, and then Kevin Westin, the field CISO from Panther. Thanks for being here, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to chat about this topic. Before we dive into, the whole detection and engineering space and detections as code and all that, tell us a bit about your background. Ken, for example, you're fairly new to Panther, and curious what brought you there and what has your interest in this detection engineering space.
Yeah, so I'm kind of old. I've been in the information security space for about 15 years now. I spent about 4 years at Splunk, where I was one of their first security specialists. Then I spent some time at Elastic as well, where I led security strategy and competitive intelligence. Then spent some time with Cyber Reason, like with XDR. So really, I really like doing investigations. I'm really into like the SIM space, like everything from insider threats, threat hunting, ransomware, you name it. I've kind of specialized in a lot of different areas. Kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. But I've been a Panther about 6 months now. It's very kind of a new approach to SIM, and it's really answering a lot of like the pain points that I've heard from a lot of folks in the SIM world. And so I got really excited about it, especially our founder, Jack Naglieri. He was a practitioner, and that's where our product came out of. And so I was really excited about it. And we're a fairly small company, I'm loving it so far.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like that background, jack of all trades is actually very good in security, at least in my experience, because you need to know a lot about, a little bit about a lot of things because you encounter so many diverse problems and different stakeholders you got to interact with and so on. So that's definitely a good background. How about you, Dakota? Obviously, I know you, but for folks who don't know Dakota Riley, tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm Dakota Riley, currently principal security engineer at Aquia, and I am very much a kind of jack of all trades type of guy, right? I have a very weird hodgepodge background with some software engineering and tool development, some security, some infrastructure, probably more than some cloud, but all kind of mingled together. So prior to joining Aquia, previously worked at a kind of B2B SaaS startup, all in an AWS, doing anything security related there. Prior to that, I was a security consultant at AWS, doing lots of kind of cloud automation tooling, the detective controls, detection engineering, that type of stuff, helping customers with that. And then prior to that, I worked at a different security vendor, doing more engineering. I think the thing that's probably more interesting about my background is I kind of ended up in this kind of realm of kind of detection engineering and automation from like the opposite direction, where I was kind of more of a cloud practitioner first, and I was kind of tasked with helping, SOCs and customers that are trying to find bad things in their environment through detection, and kind of attacked it from that angle. So, I've been kind of dabbling in that space for a bit. I was also a customer at Panther previously at my last role, and worked with, love the kind of detections as code approach. I was also even a fan, I believe, and Kid, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the original open source offering, before Panther, that I think inspired Jack was it Stream Alert? Like I was geeking out about that. So even just the idea of, managing your detections as code and like applying that type of workflow that I've learned with for infrastructure as code to it is awesome. So very excited to chat.
Yeah, so safe to say Dakota has been a fan of Panther before Panther was Panther, it sounds like. So I'm curious for both of you guys, before we dive into some of the nuance of detection engineering, detection as code, things of that nature, what is your take on the current state of like the SOC space and detection engineering space as you see it right now? And feel free, either one, you can jump in first.
Well, I think there's, being in the SIM space for a while, it's very interesting. I think there's been this bit of an evolution. When I was selling, SIM originally, like in 2015, I was selling into IT departments, and the companies, were selling services or widgets. They weren't really tech companies. But now I've found that, every company is a tech company, whether they like it or not. I think particularly we saw this with the pandemic and like this sort of mass migration to cloud. You have people that are working from home. So there's a lot of these sort of factors that have gone into sort of changing sort of the SIM landscape and the requirements for it. We're no longer in offices, right? We don't have to secure a perimeter. A lot of the SIMs that people were using came out of data centers. centers, right? They weren't really designed for cloud and cloud infrastructure, particularly at scale and the velocity of the log sources. And so that's kind of what I've really started to see, the sort of evolution. And then you start to think about it like what we're actually trying to protect now. It's not like the corporate, assets that, people's laptops and things like that. We're really securing applications that are running in the cloud that are mission critical, that if these applications go down, the company loses money. Right. So there's a direct correlation to, security, whereas it used to be a cost center. Now, it's sort of more aligned with sort of like the SREs and things like that, more in the DevOps space. But I'm sure Dakota's seen this much more intimately.
Yeah, no, I definitely love the point about, just cloud in general, like obviously remote work and clouds like that. But like, when you're taking in all these logs and even like not even just like event logs, but like statuses of information from SaaS, PaaS, just regular IaaS, like having to deal with all that, it's challenging with base infrastructure and with like just like kind of, I don't want to say legacy, but kind of the like a traditional SIM approach, right? And on top of that, even just the mental model of a SOC analyst and how you approach it, where you go from, I have a server on a network that does these things, and now you've thrown in like, oh, Office 365 or Lambda or like all these, or even GitHub, right? Like all that are all relevant and critical. I think it definitely brings up the need for change. And I think the other thing too that I think is really interesting is having it came from this from like kind of like the cloud security side. I almost kind of see like a silo breaking down where a lot of like kind of SOC functions are very focused on like just threat detection. But there's things outside of that kind of contribute to that whole picture, like the status of your infrastructure, right? Or is this thing publicly accessible? Or what was the patch status of this last asset? That all kind of puts that big picture together. So I think I would say like almost like shifting to where you're like you said, Ken, in the way of business critical, where it's not just a silo for threat detection. It's kind of whole risk posture, right? So.
Yeah, I like a couple of things you guys said there. You pointed out, both, I talked about how companies say they're not a tech company, but increasingly, I often hear we're not a software company, but every company is essentially becoming a software company. I shared a video over the weekend of the Ford CEO talking about their challenges around software development and software-enabled automobiles. Every company is driven by software. And as you point out, that kind of shifts the paradigm of cybersecurity from being a cost center to being that revenue protector. Now that, you're delivering business value through software over the internet, for example. So I want to talk to you guys about another topic. When we talk about detection engineering, one hot topic, of course, is detection as code. So for folks that aren't familiar with detection as code, what is that, and what are some of the benefits of shifting to this new paradigm?
Well, I think it's about treating your detections like with us. It actually is code because you actually write your detections in Python, and so I think also being able to apply a lot of like the software development lifecycle approaches to your detection. It just makes sense. I remember writing like Splunk queries and seeing queries that started getting to 200 lines of code. And then, you have a junior analyst or an intern that comes in and modifies one of those searches, and all of a sudden the SOC is flooded with a bunch of false positives. You need to know who the heck made that change and how do we roll it back. And that's really where detection as code really helps, because you're able to do, unit tests. You're able to very easily do version control. You could roll things back, like through GitHub Actions. You can also establish workflows. So before that intern or the junior analyst gets their new detection deployed to production, it can have someone else review it before it actually gets put out there. So it's really about increasing quality, and also in the process of doing that, we're also able to substantially reduce false positives, which is sort of Achilles heel for a lot of SIMs.
Yeah, I throw into one thing I love that you mentioned, Ken, is the change control aspect. So, one thing I would challenge most people that if you're working with a traditional style SIM is, what's your process for adding new detections? Go look at that. And I imagine it's kind of a long, drawn out, documented, run the query and dev, wait a couple, like see how many hits it takes, wait a couple months, that type of thing. And I think the biggest appeal of detections as code, or treating it that way, is that you can simplify that change management process, right? You can apply it via CI/CD automatically, like as in executing tests. Not only that, I think there's also for regulated environments, there's a very compelling story, and I've worked with this not specifically to detections as code, but other customers around telling the change management control story using the CI/CD, as opposed to create a ticket and document your exceptions in Confluence. It's all Git, right? And then additionally, and I guess Ken kind of already said this, but from the engineering side, there's something warm and fuzzy about having a common interface of Git and API docs, even though if the APIs and the YAML files, stuff like that, their schemas are different for different tools, right? But that familiar interface versus having to jump in and navigate a UI, which is error prone and human. And I, like, to me, it's like if I'm working on, an infrastructure as code repo or a, detections as code repo, that workflow is likely the same. Open a pull request, make sure my test pass, get a review and it gets merged in, right? And there's a lot of, once you get over the learning curve, right, of basically Python and stuff like that, there's a lot of agility to be had there.
Yeah, it actually, we talked a little bit about this before we jumped in here, and it's something I wanted to discuss with you guys. You're kind of rambling off a lot of stuff that is very comfortable to software engineers, software development, lifecycle processes, Git, YAML, schemas, unit testing, all these things that are very comfortable to software developers, for example, or software engineers. But some of these things may be new to traditional security practitioners coming from a, more legacy background, not used to everything being codified. For example, infrastructure as code, compliance as code, now detections as code. How do you see the workforce kind of evolving when you look at the security landscape for existing practitioners, or what opportunities also does it open up for maybe software engineers and developers looking to transition into security who are comfortable working in these workflows and with these tools, but maybe don't have a security background quite yet? I see like kind of convergence basically of security and obviously code and software development basically.
That's a really good question. It's actually something I've been dealing with. I'm actually hiring for kind of a peer to help me out with my job. And it's interesting. Like, I wanted someone that knows more about cloud security than I do, right? Like, I always try to find people that are smarter than me. And so that's been a real challenge. A lot of times people, they learn, how to do security for Windows, for example, and it's very different than a cloud environment. And so you really have to change sort of your mindset. And I think particularly with this big shift that we had with work from home and everything started pushing to cloud, I think a lot of security teams were actually caught off guard. And a lot of times I think they tried to maybe offset some of that liability or some of that responsibility to vendors. A lot of cloud security posture management tools came out there. They wanted to just send those alerts to their existing legacy SIEM and not actually have to do kind of the work and understand what's actually happening behind the scenes. But I think that's really starting to change. I think a lot of folks now are able to learn more about cloud and learn about how we can take some of the security skills we had from the old days, and then bring that into cloud environments. But it does require additional training. It requires a different mindset, and really in the organization too, they need to be very clear about that. If we're going to be a cloud first company, or we're going to be hybrid, you really need to define that, and that really needs to also dictate the structure of your security team.
So I'll put it here too, and I'll add a caveat. I think to take advantage of detections code, you don't actually have to become a full-fledged software engineer, right? I think you have to have some basic fluency with Python and the structure of a log, right? But I mean, to be fair, you have to have that with any SIM you work with, no matter what, or any tool. And then you have to have this specialized niche knowledge of their UI and their deployment process and all that. So my prediction would be kind of see your general kind of security jack of all trades person trending towards kind of knowledge of those concepts, but also some maybe 100, 200 level builder skills, not saying to build whole products, right? That's more to to write detections or to do things to, like a tool or something you buy gets you 90% of the way there, but then you can solve the 10% that's specific to your business, right? So that would be my guess. And then, I guess to add on that too, I think with any effort, with any transformational effort, it's paramount that leadership understands that they're going to have to invest cycles into learning and develop. Like I said, my favorite example called is the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. It literally calls that same thing out. I think cloud, any type of transformational effort, if you want to get the business benefit out of it, you have to be willing to pay the learning and investment price. So.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a human nature thing that we see, obviously play out in cybersecurity often is we hope that we can just buy a tool or, throw some money at it and it'll just go away and it'll fix all the things. But there's obviously a cultural aspect in terms of upskilling the workforce around technologies, new ways of working and processes and so on. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about too, Ken, you mentioned this earlier. You mentioned like kind of reducing the noise and false positives, and we all know that security teams tend to be overworked or overburdened as it is. You're often understaffed and just chasing a lot of alerts and noise, and that adds to a lot of toil and frustration and cognitive overload for security practitioners. How does this detection as code type approach, how does that help in particular to kind of drive down some of that noise and help bring highly contextual, relevant findings to the security practitioner?
Yeah, I think being able to, get more laser focused on, the threat itself when you're writing your code. Again, like nice thing about our detections is you have access to the entire Python library. It's not often that security teams can be creative, but when you have access to, a really powerful, language, right, to actually write those detections, that's one great step. And it's also very easy then to do additional enrichments around maybe threat intelligence or, asset inventory, all these other sort of data sources that we can then also get access to. We can even save state around some of these detections, like using DynamoDB in our detections, where we can save information about users and identities. This user, they logged in from Portland, and then all of a sudden we see that they logged in from Moscow a minute later, right? Like that's something that we can really identify that that's definitely a threat. And then there's also a way we can actually remove the analyst too with automation. So we leverage a Slack bot, which is awesome because particularly if it's a user, right? Hey, did you log in from Moscow just now? And then if they say yes, then you can, okay, well, that's a false positive. Right? We don't need to go bug the analyst with it. But if it's a no, then we can maybe automate a password reset, notify an analyst, things like that. So I think there's ways that we can sort of leverage automation for a lot of these tasks as well. And I think that's something that's been sort of untapped. A lot of SIMs, they'll send you all these alerts, and then you're lucky if you get to it like 2 hours or a couple of days later, right? By then that the company is probably gone, right? It's like you don't have time to do that. But if you can leverage automation to minimize kind of the workload, and then also provide those tools to the analysts, I think it's helpful. I always talk about like everyone says, oh, using AI, machine learning. I'm like, well, we're not really. It's like an Android versus a cyborg, and Android is sort of autonomous, right? That's what people always think AI is, and that's the wrong mindset. What we need to think more is about a cyborg, where we're actually taking these technologies and actually empowering the analyst and making their jobs easier, because that also frees them up to do more creative things. No one wants to sit there and wade through false positives, but hey, if I can, spend that time to go, take a cloud security class or, work on my Python skills as well, that's going to be a better investment of my time in my company to actually mitigate those threats than, throwing a bunch of false positives to an analyst.
Awesome. No, totally agree. And I'll throw in there too. I think when it comes to, like I think you mentioned, one of you mentioned CSPM, right? You just people just throw alerts in there. And the key thing that's missing almost from any security tool that generates alerts is context, like business context, environment context, like the contextualization of that. And I think like an actual, detections as code based workflow, with a flexible language like Python is the easiest way to achieve that, because you can literally, like, I think Ken mentioned, like, look up tables, or you can even, if you don't have something that's like super dynamic, you can even put it into a library and have it in your detection of like, hey, look up who owns this AWS account ID, or, or translate this person's login ID to an actual friendly name. I wish I had it on hand, but there was a really good thing that came out of TLDR Sec earlier, or it might have been the detection engineering newsletter, that was like the 4 golden rules for like standard detection engineering. And one of them was like anything that an analyst is required to look up, have it automatically enriched in the detection. And that's just much easier to accomplish with Python than it is with like a declarative query language, right? So I think that's the key there, is like automatically contextualizing things and making to it where once it gets to an analyst, they can look at it and know immediately if they need to act or not.
It's interesting you say that, because like, back in the day, it used to be that SOAR platforms, like there was, you're going to leverage these SOAR platforms to automate all these different tasks. But what they actually do was actually gather additional intelligence and context around an alert. And then they still had a human in the loop. So you still had these sort of bottlenecks, right? So it's supposed to these SOAR platforms are going to automate your whole security infrastructure and whatever. But no, you still have to have the humans involved. And so I think I really like that approach that we're now doing. We actually make that as part of the detection to provide that enrichment in that context around those alerts. So it's more actionable. You don't have to go and log into other systems to get the logs, things like that. You're able to actually act on that much more rapidly. And even the response are automated, right? Like you can run scripts, you can run all sorts of other things. So yeah, that's a really great call out.
Yeah, I like what you said, Ken, around, when you used the word automation earlier, you kind of opened the door for me to jump in with a term that we've all heard maybe once or twice lately, artificial intelligence. But you kind of dove in already with that, which is, you kind of speak about it as augmenting and enhancing our activities and our capabilities versus necessarily replacing us. And I think that that's spot on. And it's very valid, as you guys just point out, in terms of providing enrichment information and information that you would have mainly had to go get, previously now can be provided to the engineer or the practitioner on the spot, as part of their activities and workflow. So I'd like that comment. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about too is often when we hear about detection as code and detection engineering, we'll hear also another term, which is purple teaming. So for folks that don't know what purple teaming is, could you guys speak on what that is? And also, I know there's some open source tooling out there that folks tend to use for these activities like Stratus Red Team or Atomic Red Team and so on. How can, pairing purple teaming and detections as code kind of strengthen your security posture as an organization?
So I'll take a stab at this one first, but I think purple teaming is one of those terms where if you ask it to 3 different people at 3 different companies, you're going to get a different answer. But I mean, I know there's some standardization, I think with Scythe and stuff like that, but generally I think it refers to taking kind of a threat-informed workflow on the defense side, where you're taking business relevant TTPs that are actually likely to happen to you and being actively exploited in the wild, and then gauging your ability to detect, defend, and recover from those, right? I think the crazy thing and the cool thing about using like a detections as code workflow, I think Ken previously mentioned unit tests. Well, guess what? If you've got something that can detonate TTPs in your environment, you've got your unit test ammo right there, at least initially to start with. That's a workflow I love to use when I'm working with detections as code generally. One I love to lean on, and I've made a couple contributions to, is a Stratus Red Team. So it's basically Atomic Red Team, but for the cloud. So it's basically a collection of like cloud-based TTPs that have been observed by actors in the wild. It's an awesome tool. Obviously it has techniques for AWS, GCP, Kubernetes, and like I said, it's an often like when I'm working with other members of my team or somebody even newer, I'll be like, hey, I'll detonate this TTP for you. Here's some artifacts to go look up the actual event, and now that's your start of the detection for the unit test. So I think that's where they kind of make a wonderful kind of like the whole purple teaming workflow, and I mean just be able to move faster too, right? I mean almost like the nature of purple teaming is it's like a shorter feedback loop, but for your security team, right? I almost sometimes tell people it's like DevOps but for security. Maybe that's a little gross oversimplification, but yeah, so.
Yeah, I kind of like purple teaming in terms of I don't know, just being in security for a long time. There's been a lot of snake oil, and so one thing I really like to do is make sure that the tools really work and that they really will mitigate real threats. So I'll actually run real ransomware, and I'll run real attacks on infrastructure. We have a workshop too where I attacked Okta infrastructure, right? And then we're able to actually show that the tool is actually detecting what it's supposed to. Red teams are great, when you run those operations, but what are you going to do? You get a report of, things that but it's not necessarily going to be actionable. It doesn't provide any sort of guidance, right? The blue teaming, you can write detections and maybe, run some tests to see if it triggers or not. But it's not going to be a sort of a real world scenario. So, I actually like to run full on offensive operations, get a reverse shell, deploy, scripts, malware, attack Active Directory, you do all these things. And then I like to go look at the logs. What did we detect? What should we have been able to detect? What was a false positive maybe? And we can go back and refine it. So I like that it's much more iterative. And people think, oh, like we say purple teaming, but it can actually be a team of one. Like I can actually do this myself, or it can be a group effort. Like I might have someone that's a little bit more skilled in some offensive operations, maybe have them, hey, can you run this attack? And then I'll be the defender and I'll look at the logs. And there's a lot of really amazing insight that happens. Like this workshop I built, like I started attacking it and I started identifying, these Okta events that we should have been able to detect. And wrote new detections around it, right? So I think that that's really what Purple Team is about. It's testing, right? It's actually doing it in more of a real type of scenario.
Yeah, that's actually literally what I was going to say when you were closing up there. Is it kind of feels like, traditionally we've always heard, oh, you need to do tabletop testing. And anyone who's been part of that knows it's just a hypothetical, speculative activity where we're all sitting in a room like, oh, yeah, we just do X, Y, Z and it all works seamlessly. But what you're saying is like we're actually going to test that things work as we anticipate they will. And we're actually capturing the information that we think we will capture and how we're going to take action on it. So it's a much more mature approach to testing, in my opinion, than the kind of hypothetical tabletop exercises that don't actually put pen to paper or become hands-on activities basically. So I want to ask you guys as well. We talked about detection as code. For organizations that haven't went down this pathway quite yet, they're still doing kind of traditional legacy security activities. What are some of the barriers to adoption of moving towards this paradigm, whether they're cultural or technical, or workforce oriented? And then what are some recommendations about how to get started and overcome some of those challenges too?
Well, I think just working with a lot of customers, with SIM migrations and things like that. One of the biggest challenges that some of these SIM vendors, they're almost like a cult. We also have to realize that a lot of these organizations have invested a lot of money into these tools. Some of these SIM vendors have made a lot of money, and not just that, but also they've trained the teams, like they know these proprietary query languages, they're comfortable with it. A lot of these tools that people really they like it, and sometimes I hate to say it, but security people, they're like cats that don't like their litter changed, right? So it's really difficult for them to kind of go to a different tool or a different mindset. We actually started working more on integrating with some of these legacy SIMs, like focusing more on what we do best, particularly high volume, high velocity log sources. And then we can send alerts into these legacy SIMs if that's where they already have their established security workflows. So it can be a little bit easier for them to do that sort of migration. Like you can't just come in and rip and replace. I think that's something that people really need to be sensitive about for a lot of reasons, right? Some people have bet their careers on some of these platforms, right? So it's sometimes when you're coming into there, it is sort of like cult deprogramming, and then you have to kind of gain their trust. You have to show them that there is another way. But I'm not sure with Dakota, if you had this sort of experience as well, kind of migrating from other SIMs.
Yeah. I mean, not even just SIMs. I guess I think it applies to any transformational effort at all, right? You touched on so many good points. I think I'm kind of reiterating, but like I think buy-in, both, like, because I think a lot of times what happens is you'll get something that is a good idea, but it gets brought in like at the executive level, and then it trickles down, and there's a lot of like rogue resistance at the lower levels for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. People know and are comfortable with the tool. They have to be able to execute and do their job still, right? And like security operations in general is operational. Like it can't just stop. So I think getting buy-in at all levels, not just the very top or the very bottom, right? Like having the people understand, like, hey, this is the movement we're going, this is the benefits we'll get, is huge. And then obviously, like I said before, allocating like actual time for education and investment. I also think like you don't have to boil the ocean, right? Like pick like a couple really strong use cases where it's evident you'll get value. And like I said, I think a lot of cloud data sources are really great use cases for this, because they're a lot of times they're not already integrated into the SIM because people are still adopting these tools or moving to the cloud, and just the nature of the data, right? So yeah, I think it's buy-in across the board, making sure everybody's on the same page, allocating time for education, and like don't boil the ocean. Start small, find the value, and then slowly move it.
Yeah, I think you both, at least in my experience, kind of point out a lot of issues that, like you said, it's beyond just detection engineering. It's kind of any kind of transformative type effort. If it's only the executive seeing the value, everyone below them is going to kind of fight and drag their feet. It's what they're used to. It's what they know. It's what they're comfortable with. That sounds a lot like new work and learning new things. And that's, that some people don't want to do that. Or maybe it comes from the bottom up, and then the executive doesn't see the value, and they're not really putting their power behind it, or buy-in or financial resources in terms of investments and so on. So very pertinent points in both regards. Last question for both of you. When we look forward to see, say next, couple of years here, where do you see detection engineering going? What are some of the big predictions or things you'll see as it keeps evolving within the industry, for example?
Well, at least what I'm seeing is that we at Panther, I feel like we sort of pioneered this concept, and I think you're going to start seeing other SIM vendors kind of follow suit, particularly when they start to move more in sort of the DevOps and the cloud space. There's just so many benefits to this approach, and it just makes sense. And again, the detections, we're getting much more complex. We're starting to incorporate machine learning into some of this as well. And it's going to get more complex before anything else, and the volume of data is going to increase exponentially, right? Like the data volume isn't going to decrease, right? Like so you need to find solutions that are going to scale, and also make it so it is much more of an iterative and collaborative process. It's not just one person that's writing SIM rules anymore. It's usually a larger team that's doing it. And so focusing on collaboration, I think that's going to be key. More of like a team effort when it comes to writing detections versus one really smart person that just manages the SIM. Like those days are gone.
I totally agree with everything said there. I think the one thing I'd love to maybe this is me hoping and projecting that this will happen, but I think the breakdown of silos and that security operations doesn't just have to be just threat detection, because I've had several conversations in the past where they'd be like, hey, this might be a great candidate for something to detect because it's very risky. And they'll be like, well, it's not really a threat detection thing. Let's go to this team instead. And I mean, maybe that speaks more to the security data as a whole, right? And having that not just as a silo as this team does infrastructure compliance, this team does threat detection, because they're all related, right? There has to be vulnerable infrastructure to compromise it. Vice versa, right? It helps to know what was vulnerable in the first place, so you're tracing the event back. So my hope is those those silos will break down and kind of go to more of a kind of unified approach. I also would, again, I'm probably projecting here on what I would hope to happen, is seeing, the shift from your traditional tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 to more of almost like an engineer driven workflow. I know AWS, there's public references somewhere of it where they've talked about how their SOC is almost more of it's not so much, it's still SOC, right? I think they say they don't have a SOC, but it is still functionally a security operations center, but they have less of your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type analysts, and they have engineers that build automation, and then they do on-call rotations of babysitting and responding to that automation, right? And I think there's a cultural benefit in that too, because you're incentivized to fix things if you're the one responsible for the repercussions of them, right? So yeah, maybe that was more of what I hope will happen, but
Yeah, I think I think I'm with you on that one. I hope to kind of not only responsibility or accountability, but empower the folks closest to the problems to resolve them, and then build that cultural rapport and trust so they feel comfortable doing it, and then communicating with the security team about what happened, and without feeling they're going to get have some retribution or some kind of punishment or something like that. So that said, we covered a lot of great information in terms of detection as engineering. We covered detection as code, the codification of alerts and notifications, driving down noise. Definitely appreciate you both jumping on and joining us here today. So Ken, Dakota, they'll take us out real quick for folks that want to find you guys and chat about all things detection engineering. Where can they find you guys? Where are you active?
You can find me just at ken@panther.com. I'll also be at Black Hat and DEF CON. So hopefully, if you can come to our booth there, we'll be there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also teaching a workshop during Black Hat as well as a presentation. It's on the schedule there. So if you're interested in the purple teaming, I'm going to be doing a 2-hour session. So if you're at Black Hat, it's no additional cost. So hope to see you all there.
Cool. I am a little less of a road warrior. I will be at reInvent, but that's a couple months away. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Dakota Riley LinkedIn. I respond to messages, comments, memes, preferably. GitHub too. My GitHub's on my LinkedIn, but LinkedIn's a reliable way to catch me. Always happy to chat with anybody.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And thanks everyone who joined us today. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.